I'd like to follow up on why, ultimately, we are here today. Why are young people in Hebron struggling against their ethnic subjugation, and why is it all so relevant to the Labor Party? 102 years ago, in the midst of the Great War, propagandists for the then relatively recent racial nationalist ideology of Zionism approached the British and played on classic anti-Jewish stereotypes to which they were confident the British would be receptive. The Zionists pretended that the Jews exert great worldwide influence and could help rally the United States on Britain's behalf in the war. And all the Zionists would need in return was, well, how about Palestine? Now, for the British, this was a triple win. Not only did they believe the trope about the power of the Jews to influence world events, in this case the outcome of the war, but secondly, in the bargain, they got a huge Jewish ghetto far away to keep Jews from coming to Britain. And thirdly, they believed that the Zionists could serve as surrogates to expand the British Empire to Palestine. And so, over the impassioned objections of principled people like Edwin Montagu, who bluntly and correctly accused his government of anti-Semitism for acquiescing to the Zionists, the British became the midwife for their racial nationalist project. And lest there be any doubt, it is explicit in British records that the British knew all along, that the Zionist project was not about some vague, lofty spiritual home, but it was to seize all of Palestine at a minimum and to ethnically cleanse it of non-Jews. All the protestations to the contrary, whether that implicit in the Balfour Declaration itself, or the statements of people like Chaim Weizmann, or David Ben-Gurion, or Winston Churchill, these were all blatant lies. What is going on today, at this moment in Palestine, was always the plan, and the British, in 1917, knew it. But I wonder what they would have thought if they could have known that as a result of their actions, a century later, we would be here today fighting against Zionist corruption of British democracy, of British free speech, and of British academic integrity. 2 decades after the war to end all wars, the world is again at war, the Allies struggling against the most terrible racial nationalist movement the world has ever known. And in 1945, racial nationalism is defeated, averting an unthinkably dark future for humankind. Well, racial nationalism is defeated with one exception. Zionism managed not only to escape accountability, but counterintuitively to use the horrors of the war to further its own brand, however different, its own brand of racial, ethnic, imperialist nationalism. And in 1947, the UN, caving to US political pressure and years of relentless Zionist terrorism, denies Palestinian self-determination and sets the stage for the creation of the Israeli state, a state that the UN in 1947 already knew perfectly well would never abide by its agreed borders. Today, 7 decades later, the tragedy we face is what happens when a violent, racist ideology is not merely tolerated, but actively empowered by the world's powerful nations. Now, there are several reasons why we of the allegedly enlightened West empower Israel, but the one that concerns us here today during the Labor Conference is Israel's wielding of the smear of anti-Semitism, all furthered by a mass media that finds it less troublesome to go along with the lies rather than fulfill their obligation to society. Israel's anti-Semitic pretense of being interchangeable with Jews as a people and its exploitation of anti-Semitism to silence opponents is its not-so-secret weapon. By holding Jewish identity hostage as a human shield, Israel makes condemnation of the state, condemnation of Jews as Jews, thus making criticism of Zionism and Israel by this grotesque construct anti-Semitic by definition. Israel constantly waves over our heads the phrase, the Jewish state, like some talisman to frighten us, not a Jewish state in the sense of a national faith that any nation might adopt. irrelevant to ethnicity and stopping at the borders, but the Jewish state. Yet at the same time, Israel would have us believe that its claim to be the Jewish state is no different than, say, Liechtenstein as a Catholic state, or Algeria as a Muslim state, or India as a Hindu state, or Burma as a Buddhist state. But this is sleight of hand. Israel's claim is altogether different and is unique in the world. Israel claims to be Jews by blood transnationally. Let's take my last example, Burma as a Buddhist state. What if Burma were to exploit Buddhists exactly as Israel exploits Jews? Now, like Israel, Burma is engaged in ethnic cleansing, for which it has been universally condemned. But what if the Burmese propagandists were to announce that, look, we are not a Buddhist state, we are the Buddhist state. We are the manifestation of the Buddhist people. A nationality based not on citizenship in the political sense, but on blood descent worldwide. We are the self-determination of this construct we have invented called the Buddhist people. And then Burma's propagandists announce a new definition of anti-Buddhist bigotry, the Buddhist equivalent of IHRA, which in summary codifies that any claim made against the Burmese state, for example, to accuse Burma of racism for its ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, is instead a libel against Buddhists, all Buddhists, simply because they are Buddhists. And Burmese propagandists come to Britain and smear anyone or any organization as bigots if they do not accept and enforce their new definition of anti-Buddhist bigotry. And when principled people still challenge Burma for its crimes, the Burmese inquisitors scream racism, and all the media, all the way from the BBC and The Guardian down to the Daily Mail, ignorantly feast on the scandal. The anti-racists are expelled from their parties, organizations, or jobs, and every time they try to speak, they are blocked by the Burmese propagandists. Now, when I describe this, it is so preposterous as to be comical. Yet it is precisely what we have allowed Israel to do. And just as Burma would implicitly be transferring culpability for its crimes onto Buddhists in order to carry this out, as this alleged race, in order to inoculate itself, Israel is directly claiming that it is Jews, not individuals that happen to be Jewish, as they might happen to be vegetarian or have brown eyes, but Jews as a people who are the doers of its crimes. Israel cannot have it both ways. In other words, traditional anti-Semitism can only attack externally. Despite all its murders, all its horrors, all its desecration, traditional anti-Semitism is powerless to lessen the integrity of Jews or Judaism. Zionism, if we accept it, does. If we accept it, as Labor regretfully has done, then we have libeled Jewry itself. All our lives, we are endlessly accustomed to politicians and political parties feigning innocence when they are guilty. We now live in the extraordinary situation where this is reversed, in which the Labour Party and its leader are confessing to crimes of which they are innocent, like something out of the purges of Stalinism or Pol Pot's Cambodia. Confessing to a crime you didn't commit for fear of what might happen if you don't confess. Tragically, Corbyn foolishly believed that if he confessed, the inquisitors might leave him alone. Corbyn's attempt at appeasement began just after he won Labour leadership in 2015, but this was always going to be futile because Corbyn's long history is one of dedicated anti-racism and thus implicitly anti-Zionist. And so already the following month, the Daily Mail, quoting unnamed experts, reported that anti-Semitism was suddenly so bad that, I quote the Daily Mail, Jews feel as threatened as they did in the Holocaust. Imagine that. A grotesque belittling of what Hitler's victims endured. In April 2016, then, the National Review ran a piece entitled, quote, Why the Left Hates Jews, and jumped right to Corbyn and the UK Labour Party in the first sentence. The following month, the Daily Mail said the rate of, quote, Hate crimes against Jews soars. As report says, anti-Semitism is at the core of far-left beliefs. We are to think Labor Party. By January 2017, The Telegraph reports that anti-Semitism had increased again, specifically because of Corbyn and the Labor Party. It continued to get even worse. In July, the BBC and The Independent both report, quote, anti-Semitic attacks hit record high again in the UK. And again in February of 2018, anti-Semitism, yes, has soared yet higher, with Labour said to be in, quote, total disarray for its failure to confront what one would surmise are the hordes of seething anti-Semites comprising its membership. None of these media betrayed any sense of wonder at the charade, nor any curiosity as to the methodology, data, and motives of the sources. Typically the Community Service Trust, the Board of Deputies, and the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, all of which are Zionist propaganda fronts. And when the BBC ran a report headlined, quote, over a quarter of British people hold anti-Semitic attitudes, it did not even question why the survey, if you actually read the fine print, matched attitudes towards Jews with attitudes towards Israel. Zionism thrives on anti-Jewish bigotry and fears nothing more than a world in which all Jews live in safety and equality worldwide. Organizations claiming to represent the Jewish community make an industry out of maintaining anti-Semitism hysteria, creating what I would call legitimately a mass psychosis, while aligning themselves with the true anti-Semitism of emerging neo-fascist but invariably pro-Zionist regimes, especially in Eastern Europe, in Brazil, in the United States, and the Philippines. Anti-Semitism, real or imagined, is Zionism's oxygen. Whether or not one likes Jeremy Corbyn's politics, we should all be outraged that Israel's propagandists could influence who leads Britain, arguably robbing Britain of an honest, progressive prime minister who had been the hope of millions. I have never met or had any contact with Mr. Corbyn or his staff, and I have never had any official position in Britain, yet even I was used in an attempt to smear him. When I, a permanent tax-paying British resident, was invited to discuss British source documents held by the British government about the British mandate in the British city of Portsmouth, Britain's supposed anti-radicalization program, PREVENT, closed us down, not just one venue after another, but throughout the entire city on behalf of the Israeli state. After which the Daily Mail linked me to Mr. Corbyn, our mugshot side by side, with the usual lies in the headline about what I allegedly would have said at the thwarted talk. And by the way, despite the considerable efforts of Portsmouth and South Downs PSC, PREVENT has to this day refused to clear my name. Now, I'd like to take a brief look at the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, so-called definition of anti-Semitism that Labour has endorsed. According to IHRA, anti-Semitism includes, quote, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Now, right off, this is a very strange clause because it altogether omits the sole point, the only point upon which the entire definition depends. Are the Jewish citizens being accused because they are Jewish or because of their actions without regard to their ethnicity? Now, if we give the IHRA the benefit of the doubt and assume that despite how long it is and how verbose it is, its authors simply overlook the only point that matters and assume that Jews are being accused by virtue of being Jews, then yes, of course, this is true anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, in the very next example, we find out that Zionism is itself guilty. Quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. So, Israel is the self-determination of this construct called the Jewish people? Jews, simply because they are Jews, are intrinsically bound to this nation state? If that's the case, then Zionism is the theft of individual Jewish self-determination. Worse, if in fact Israel is a racist endeavor, which it blatantly is and always has been, then according to this definition endorsed by Labor, racism is the self-determination of Jews as Jews. Hard to imagine anything more anti-Semitic than that. Yet for Zionism, it gets worse, because according to the first clause, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal, etc., Zionism is anti-Semitic, but according to this one, it's anti-Semitic to point it out. The juxtaposition of these two clauses is extraordinary. IHRA is engineered to make it anti-Semitic to end Zionist anti-Semitism. By the next example, there is no longer even the pretense that Jews are the topic. The topic is Israel. Quote, using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis. And in the next example as well, one is left wondering how Jews have vanished as the IHRA's professed concern. Quote, drawing comparison of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. So, if it is against Jews to make such an analogy about the Israeli state, no matter how valid an analogy might or might not be regarding that state, it is, according to IHRA, the Jews that are committing the acts, not the Israeli state per se. Again, it is IHRA, not anyone making such analogies about Israel, that implicitly claims this. Comparing the contemporary policy, as the definition had it, of some nation state, Israel or otherwise, to a political movement or ideology, Nazism or otherwise, can be anti-Semitic only if the IHRA authors are committing the anti-Semitism of this final IHRA example. Quote, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. Yes, thank you. Holding Jews, or any other ethnicity, let's say Buddhists, collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, or any other state, say Burma, is indeed true racism. It's bigotry, prejudice, ignorance. Yet this is Zionism's very core. If we accept Zionism, the actions of Jews as a people and the Israeli state are synonymous. This would be racist on its very principle, even if Israel were the nicest state in the galaxy. But, of course, in the ultimate Orwellian conundrum, Israel has inoculated itself against this as well. I will finish by quoting this extraordinary, circular reasoning from the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism that inoculates Zionism not just from us, but from itself. Quote, accusing Jews, now bearing in mind that Jews are whom the CIA is accusing, not us, accusing Jews of making accusations of anti-Semitism in order to aid a hidden agenda is, you guessed it, a well-established anti-Semitic slur. So there you have it, no loose ends. Thank you.